All right, everybody, welcome. This is the February 13th meeting of the Freedom Hub Working Group. Got another fantastic session again this week. And before we get started, just want to remind everybody that these are recorded. So if you can't come, a couple things happen. You get a notice telling you who's coming up. And in that same notice, there's always a link to the one that was the week before. So you have a chance to go backwards and review it. They're also beginning to be posted on two separate websites. So there's one that we've got of our own that's part of the offshoot of the hub, and this one is called the Health Freedom Hub. And you'll notice already posted on there, there's about 80 plus interviews, but here are the first three that are from the working group. So it's John Goodman, Chris Street, and Stephen Moore. And then they're concurrently posted here on Brighteon, if you're familiar with this, which is the kind of the free market competitor to YouTube. And so they're starting to be posted over here. What's nice about them over here is that you're able to get kind of more notoriety beyond anything you're doing on your own website, a la YouTube, where other people see it and so on. This is like their main page. So you can see there's a lot of stuff and topics and channels and whatnot. So Charles, why don't you explain a little bit about today and we'll get cooking.
Thanks, Jeff, and welcome, Kerry and Michael. So we've had a lot of good high-level speakers and topics since September, including John Goodman and Steve Moore and others. And today it's really fantastic to be able to talk about this issue that not many folks really know about, but those who do know it like getting hit by a Mack truck. And you'll understand why soon enough. If you act independently with the public schools or your doctors, or the hospitals, or even in family court, the government will threaten to break up your family with a child protective service. And it really is a scary issue when you get down to it. So I'm excited for Kerry McDonald from the Foundation for Economic Education in Harvard to talk about some of her blogging on the issue. She has a new book out on homeschooling that she'll probably want to discuss. And so she's a budding expert in this broad topic, and it is very broad. And then we'll have Michael Ramey from the Parental Rights Organization talk about an amendment that his group is promoting to restore a balance with the government on how families can operate independently and raise good kids. And so I really look forward to what they say, and then we'll open up to Q&A. So have at it with the Q&A part. And coming up, I always preview the next few weeks, the next 4 weeks specifically, on who's going to be coming up. So, every week is going to be fireworks and great stuff. Next week, we have Roman Buehler, who's a former counsel to Newt Gingrich when he was Speaker in the House. And Roman has a project to use the Convention of the States process to pass a new amendment to the Constitution to require an additional congressional passage of regulations if they are what's called economically significant, if they have a real big impact on economic growth. So that's a sledgehammer approach to slow down some regulations that can hurt economic growth. Invite your friends to that. The next week we have Joel Salatin. I think that's how you pronounce his last name. He's an innovative farmer in the Shenandoah. He's big into the rights of local farmers to sell food without too much government interference. Think raw milk, artisan cheeses, etc. It's a real hassle to be an entrepreneur if you're a local family farmer. So we'll talk about those issues February 27th. The next Wednesdays, getting into March, I'll just talk about the first 2 Wednesdays. March 6th, we have Becky Akers, who for a long time has written about immigration rights, but more specifically for this Wednesday, Transportation Security Administration, the hassles of flying and screening at airports. So we're really going to pile on TSA that week. So bring your friends. Everyone hates TSA. And finally, March 13th, Jacob Hornberger from the the Foundation of Freedom Future, FFF organization. They have a great daily email. They get the best stories. If you're not subscribing to that, he might talk. I think he's going to talk about the difference in the economy and freedom from 100 years ago till now. And some folks like those big issues like we had with David Beto a few weeks ago on mutual aid versus welfare. So, Jeff, I think we'll let Kerry start. If you have anything else to say, Jeff?
Oh, I think that's a perfect position for her to jump in there. So, Kerry, if you'd like to kind of add anything else that Charles maybe left out, and have at it.
Sure. Thank you so much for inviting me here today. I'm thrilled to be here. Also delighted that Michael can add his voice, as I think that parental rights is really the crux of the issue. So the article that I think triggered your invitation for me to join this group is an article I wrote recently for FEE, the Foundation for Economic Education, on weaponizing child protective services. And so the way that this article came about, I was growing increasingly interested in the sort of anecdotal evidence I was gathering from my homeschooling advocacy work with families across the country, and hearing stories about families that decided to withdraw their children from school for homeschooling and then would be visited by child protective services. And often, most often, these investigations were completely unfounded. It was a case of parents not being satisfied with the school, potentially disagreeing with the school on certain aspects of the child's education or care. For example, refusing to put their ADHD child on medication the way that the school would have wanted, and that sort of thing. So I thought that this was something around homeschooling, and there was a recent case of a lawsuit in my home state of Massachusetts of a homeschooling family that was suing the school district because of this very issue, removing their kids to homeschool and then being visited by CPS. But as I started researching and investigating, I realized that this issue is much, much bigger and broader and more malevolent than just homeschoolers. So the research that I discovered was a widespread, well-documented research study by the Hetchinger Report, which is a highly respected education media site, and HuffPost, that was published in November, and I linked to that in my FEE article. And what they found was that schools, in their words, are weaponizing CPS against, in their words, obstinate parents. Parents who are disagreeing with what the school thinks is in the best interest of that child, refusing to put their children on medication if the school thinks that that should be the case, and any other sort of disagreements. And I found this so startling. And even more disheartening is that the families that are being reported to CPS are quite often, most often, families from sort of minority groups, low-income families, otherwise disadvantaged families that simply don't have the resources to fight back. And in the Hetchinger Report, HuffPost Joint Investigative Report, they found that, sadly, many of these more disadvantaged families say that these visits from CPS are a frequent, and again, in their words, expected part of parenting. I just find that to be, just as a parent myself, horrifying that these parents sort of expect frequent visits from CPS, for in many cases, simply disagreeing with government schools. So that the crux of the article for FEE is around that. But I think especially where many of you are healthcare professionals and interested in healthcare, there's so much more to this story. And there's a recent book out published last October by Diane Redleaf called "They Took the Kids Last Night: How the Child Protection System Puts Families at Risk." And Redleaf had an article in the Atlantic that I think you can also see in the links here on your dashboard, that talks about her book and her research. Redleaf is a family defense attorney. She's been defending families for 30 years and founded an organization that helps families, particularly disadvantaged families, to fight back against CPS. Her book, again, is particularly interesting, I think, to many of you because she profiles instances where it's families running up against accusations of medical neglect, or, for example, bringing their kid to the emergency room for a broken bone. You know, they fell down in the playground and broke a bone, and then getting a call or having someone at the hospital call CPS and opening up an investigation and potential child abuse. And it's just outrageous. The families that she profiles in her book, she talks about this in the Atlantic article that you see the link to there. She's had other articles at the Cato Institute about this as well. And really just these awful stories of, I mean, we can kind of get into the weeds, but just the sort of entanglement of, for example, pediatricians being entangled into the CPS system. And so you have this instance where, you know, pediatricians are investigating at the behalf of CPS. They're investigating these families, but often it was the pediatrician, the CPS pediatrician's hospital that made the call, so that there's this sort of confirmation bias. I mean, there's just so much going on there. And again, most of these cases, there wasn't abuse, but the families get, you know, put through the ringer. So there's, you know, so many things that we could talk about and decide where we want to go with this. I think there's also lots of solutions. We can talk about the mandatory reporting laws, which I think are a big piece of this, where healthcare professionals and educators are required by law to report suspected abuse. There are penalties if they don't report suspected abuse, and so that could be potentially leading to some of these problems. There's also sort of this black box, I think, of CPS and child welfare services, where they refuse to report, to comment on any individual cases. As they say, it's always out of privacy concerns. Maybe we could suggest more transparency there. And then the other piece, in fact, just this Sunday in the Boston Globe, there was a front page article, an awful, disheartening story about a mom who lost custody of her 6 children after a long battle with CPS. And as I was reading the story and just finding it, you know, just so sad, that I just kept wondering, why wasn't anyone charged with a crime? How were these children removed from this mother, and she had her parental rights severed, and no one was ever charged with a crime? It's like a shadow judicial system. So yeah, you're right. There's so much we can talk about here, and maybe, you know, get to some solutions.
I had myself muted. That was very good, Kerry. Before we kind of start to get into a bit of a discussion, why don't we let Michael chime in a little bit and kind of stir up the pot a little bit more, if that's possible. Michael, are you there?
I'm here.
Yeah, why don't you kind of take it from what she's been describing, and then we'll kind of open up and get some feedback from some of the others.
Okay. Yeah. So Kerry kind of hit a nerve for me, because I'm with parentalrights.org. We're into the whole broad area of parental rights. Our primary reason for existing as an organization is to preserve the traditional role of parents in the text of the U.S. Constitution, which it turns out is a very big, long-term project, especially needing 2/3 in the Senate, 2/3 in the House in our very divided, very contentious political atmosphere right now. That's just been impossible. But that's our big picture thing, because we recognize, as Kerry already alluded to, that, you know, parental rights are the foundational concern. They're the bottom line for all of it. If we protected every other liberty, but we lost our parental rights, then a generation from now, all those other liberties disappear. The ability to direct the upbringing, education, care of our children is what everything else is built on. And so she's pointed out some of the major concerns that we have. But I think the one that gets me the most personally is the new subspecialty field that has just been adopted in the medical field over the last 5 or 8 years of child abuse pediatrics. Diane Redleaf talks about it a lot in her book, They Took the Kids Last Night, that Kerry already mentioned. And it really, that's the thing that really grates me, because it's based on this lie that a doctor can look at a particular injury and say, okay, this was caused by abuse, and they can diagnose abuse and they can diagnose a guilty verdict, and they often will read an x-ray and they disagree with the radiologist whose specialty is reading x-rays, or they'll look at a child with a brain injury and they'll disagree with the neurologist whose specialty is brain surgery. And yet, because they're a child abuse pediatrician and they're saying, well, this is child abuse, then their diagnosis is something that the CPS can just carry into the courtroom and say, yes, here's a medical expert who's saying this was abuse, so we need to take the kids because mom or dad did this. And they don't have to say when or where or how it happened, or even whether it was mom or dad. They just have the doctor saying, well, this is child abuse, and they'll take the kid for that. And nothing grates on my nerves more than having a pediatrician or any professional whose entire career definition is based on their being able to go into a courtroom and diagnose a guilty verdict. That's not the way our legal system is supposed to work, but that's the way our medical system has set up for our legal system to work. And so what we have now is, for instance, with shaken baby syndrome, we'll have in one courtroom, a judge is overturning a verdict from 15 years ago where dad was sentenced to life for shaking his baby to death because the science doesn't hold up. And the next county over, a dad is being sentenced to life for shaken baby syndrome because a medical child abuse pediatrician has gone in and testified that, this is the diagnosis, this child was shaken to death. And so there's just this inconsistency from courtroom to courtroom because of this specialty that this is my personal opinion, but the specialty just really shouldn't exist. There's no scientific basis for it. And it really is being used to destroy families. Now, I would say this about CPS or DHS or DCYF, whatever it's called, wherever you are. It's this, that, okay, there are those masterminds out there who can game any system. Any system can be gamed by somebody. But if we have a system that is consistently being gamed all over the country by not criminal masterminds, just average folks, whether it's the school system or the medical system or whoever it is, then there's a problem with that system. And we need to fix our child abuse system because it's being gamed by the schools, it's being gamed by the hospitals, it's being gamed by anybody and weaponized. That's a great word, Kerry. It's being weaponized against innocent families, and there need to be safeguards to our liberties to keep that from happening. So parentalrights.org, in addition to our big long-term goal of passing that amendment, we are working with a bipartisan coalition of like-minded organizations, and it's actually that United Family Advocates that Diane Redleaf is the co-chair of, and we're working with her. She kind of tends to be on one side of the aisle. We tend to be on the other. But when it comes to parental rights, I love Diane Redleaf. We are 100% in agreement. And so because we're on opposite sides of the aisle, we have different sets of friends. And we can go into Congress and talk on either side of the aisle and say, look, we need to get this done. One of the things we're working on is we need to change anonymous reporting to confidential reporting. We understand about not telling the alleged perpetrator the identity of who called, because if it's a real child abuse situation and that's a real abusive person, that could cause risk. We get that, but somebody needs to know who's making that call, because if people are abusing the hotline, those trends are going to show up over time. And so we need to be able to record that. So that's one of the things that we're working on, and that's an important one. So, but there are other things that we're working on as well to try to amend CAPTA, to try to change the laws, to try to change the way states handle these situations. We want to be able to protect the innocent families. The hotline calls, based on the national figures, the AFCARS study, that's where the federal government, the Department of Health and Human Services, gathers the numbers from all the different states and compiles the data and releases it about once a year. According to the most recent one, about 83% of investigations turn out to be unfounded, and so we're talking only about 1 in 6 are actual cases of abuse, but every one of those causes trauma to the family that's under investigation. So 5 out of 6 are causing, and the only trauma that child ever suffered was at the hands of CPS. Whereas if it's an anonymous hotline call, then the number drops from 17% to 4%. And that's just unconscionable. So we want to that's one of the things that we want to fix.
It's Kerry again. I just want to add to Michael's great overview that I think part of the reason that we're seeing sort of uptick in a lot of these anonymous calls is related to the sort of larger if you see something, say something mentality that we've had since 9/11 and sort of focused on suspicious activities, and that I think has led to nosy neighbors or passersby just thinking that they can place an anonymous call and that they're doing the right thing, and they're not realizing the consequences of their actions to innocent families.
No, I fully agree with that. And part of that is systematic. I mean, part of that is a problem with the system, because people have a certain expectation of what is going to happen. And I don't think that's actually what happens. And people are expecting that folks will just check and make sure the kid's okay. But the way the law is built, once an investigation is opened, CPS has to go down this whole checklist before they're allowed to let it go. So that's another thing that we're working on in the coalition, is we want to provide what we call an off-ramp, where if a sheriff's deputy, a CPS worker, whoever it is, they make contact with the family, they can immediately tell that there's nothing going on. As it is now, they've still got to go down the whole checklist. They've got to check all the boxes. We want to provide an off-ramp of sorts where when it's obvious there's nothing going on here, this is a fine family, they don't need any intrusion, they just close it right there. We want them to have the freedom to do that, and that's going to protect families.
Is some of what you're describing kind of need to be done on a federal level, or is this a state-by-state issue, or what's the most effective way to kind of get to success?
Well, so we're finding that the most effective way is that it's looking like CAPTA, the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, is coming up for renewal this spring. For whatever reason, the stars have aligned. They haven't renewed it in several years, even though it was due to be renewed. But now suddenly this spring, the Democrats in the House and the Senate, the Republicans in the Senate, want to renew it. So it's coming up, and fortunately, again, because of the bipartisan nature of our coalition, we've got the ears of both sides. That's where it needs to take place, because that act basically says to the states, from the federal government is saying to the states, we will give you money for child welfare as long as you do it this way. Now, it's completely voluntary, of course, but what state is going to give up all those federal dollars if they can just do it that way and get the money? So it's really almost impossible to make those changes at a state-by-state level if you don't include CAPTA. That's kind of the starting point. So that's where we're working right now.
And does it look like
federal?
Does it look like you'll be able to shift that into a better direction from where it sits, or is there one side of the aisle trying to push it in an obnoxious place, or what's the reality of that?
Well, right now what we're finding is we're finding willing ears on both sides. People who would be very strange bedfellows by themselves. One of our organizations, because we were started by very conservative folks, and now we kind of reach across the aisle. More of our Facebook audience votes Democrat than Republican, which is amazing for where we started. But one of our good friends in the Senate is Mike Lee, who's very far on the right side. And on the other hand, one of Diane Redleaf's best friends is Gwen Moore out of Wisconsin, who's a progressive liberal and a Democrat in the House. So because of the nature of that coalition, we can work with both. I mean, you don't see Mike Lee and Gwen Moore working together on things, but this is where we've got the ear of both of them. And so we're talking with them and trying to move it in a good direction.
Where do you think you'll be able to get it to go? I mean, what would be a nirvana as far as what you think you could actually accomplish in reality?
Wow. So that confidential reporting, as opposed to anonymous, is a big thing for us. The off-ramp is another big thing. One of the biggest things is a set standard for removal. This is huge. It's like if you can't check these boxes, you don't remove a child. Maybe there is some neglect going on. Maybe there is some maltreatment. But if it doesn't reach this level, if it's not immediate, if there's not an immediate danger, solid evidence that there's an immediate danger of physical or immediate risk of physical danger to the child, then you don't need to remove the child. If the child has a health condition and they need medical treatment, then maybe you need to go before a judge and you need to get a court order to order that medical treatment. But if it's not life-threatening, if this is something that's, this could be bad if it's left untreated for the next 6 months, you don't have to do an emergency removal. You just need to go before the judge and say, hey, look, we're going to have to court order this because folks aren't doing it. And I mean, that's a bad case. That's a bad situation. But the fact is there are CPS, agents and agencies out there who will take children away over much more menial things than that. I mean, it's just trivial.
Yeah, it's an easy thing for them to do. So what else can we do to help? Any individuals or any of the people that have some influence in blogs and whatnot, what can we help do to drive your activities?
I would say the biggest thing, really, and this might seem basic and boring, but really the biggest thing is call attention to it. Really, this goes on in large part because people don't know. Like Kerry said, people make this call. You see something, say something, and they make the call, and they never really expect the kind of trauma it's going to impose on that innocent family. So let them know. Tell them in advance. This is what to expect. This is what is happening, and just get the word out there.
Well, that's a good one for sure.
Sorry, this is Kerry. I would also add, in terms of what you can do, what this community can do, is just supporting parents. I feel like we have this sort of large assault on parents and on their choices, questioning their competence and their abilities, and this sense that no, the government, the state can do better, I think is pervasive and getting increasingly so. So anything that we can do to support parents, to encourage parents, and to really to become real ambassadors for parental rights, I think can go a long way toward helping.
Fantastic. Who's there?
Charlie.
Yeah.
If we maybe could remind folks to click the raise hand symbol if they want to ask a question, in case we get a lot of folks jumping in at the same time, that might help keep an order to the questions. Do you know that raising hand symbol?
I got a couple hands up right now. I'm trying to kind of mute or unmute as I can see.
I do have a question.
Ed, once you start.
So other folks have said that problems that exist with that whole family breakup incentive stems from a standard CPS uses that is subjective. And I think, Michael, you got a bit on that with a standard for removal. That right now, CPS can come up with any reason because their standards are subjective. Negligence. I think negligence is the standard, which is a subjective word. Number two, what about that law Hillary passed to federally bonus foster parent placements that some folks name as a incentive that has exacerbated removal decisions to get that federal matching money for foster placement? Have you heard? Haven't either of you, Kerry or Michael, have a comment on those two things: the subjective nature of the negligence standard and the role of federal funding that incentivizes breaking up unnecessarily?
Yeah, I would first on the subjective. Yeah, there are some states that are starting to tackle that. I believe it was Arizona, it might have been Utah last year, passed a law that pretty much lays out what neglect is not. And that's huge because something like 80% of all child removal cases involve a charge of neglect. And I use the word charge lightly there because, as Kerry pointed out, they take children away and they never charge anybody with a crime. So I'm not talking about being criminally charged, but I'm just talking about where they say in their CPS report, this was neglect. It's something like 80%. And that's a very subjective term. It's an abused term. And so there have been some states, again, Arizona or Utah, just last year, really paved the way, but I don't think by any means they're going to be the last state to do this, where the legislature has laid out now in the law and said, this is not neglect. Letting your child walk to school if they're reasonably mature and it's not that far, that's not neglect. Letting your child play unsupervised in the park that's within view of your home, that's not neglect. You know, that kind of thing. Poverty is not neglect, which is another thing that we're trying to work into federal law. Is a statement that basically comes down to poverty is not neglect. You know, not being able to feed your child is a very different thing from not being willing to feed your child. So neglect, it's a very subjective thing, but it's something states are starting to take issue with and starting to fix. That, you know, the agencies are abusing it, but legislators are beginning to realize the agencies are abusing it. You know how, like, you'll buy a lawnmower now and you in the instruction manual there's a warning, don't lift this over your head and try to use it to trim your hedges. You know, we have these ridiculous warnings. Lawmakers are beginning to realize that our CPS agencies kind of need some of those ridiculous warnings too. It's like, it's common sense, but because we have to spell it out for you, here it is. That's not neglect. So leave the families alone. But it is. It's very subjective. Whether you get a good judge or not makes a huge difference in a family case. And that's not the way the law is supposed to work. It's supposed to be, if you get any kind of decent judge at all, you're going to get similar results because it's similar laws, but it's so subjective. And I would add, regarding the federal funding for foster care, that's another issue in the CAPTA bill and in the American Safe Families Act, ASFA or ASFA, that the coalition is looking at. It's a little down the road because CAPTA is suddenly we have that opportunity now, but we are looking at that too. We want families, you know, if you do have to take children away from their parents, most of those kids, their parents are not the only family they've got. They've got grandma, granddad, aunts, uncles, you know, older adult brothers and sisters, whatever. They've got family willing to take them. But ASFA, which had a good intention, but it is abused, and it does give incentives for foster care that the state doesn't get if they put that child in their aunt's home or if they put them with grandma. And so the state is going to go where the money is, and that's just natural human nature. And unfortunately, you know, when you have governments are made up of people, so we do want to tackle that too. It is definitely an issue that needs to be addressed.
I would just add there on Michael's point about placing children with family members. Diane Redleaf also talks a lot about this. One of the sneaky things that CPS does often is we'll come into a family and they'll say, okay, you need to create a safety plan, what they euphemistically call a safety plan, and that often entails allowing the children to go to a family member with, you know, or have the family under 24-hour supervision by other family members, or else they're told that their kids will be removed immediately into foster care. And this is all happening without a court order. And so parents on the receiving end of this, I think Diane Redleaf basically says this is like someone saying it's your money or your life. You know, what parent is not going to say, okay, I'll sign the safety plan and let my child go with a family member or have me supervised by a family member, as opposed to this threat of them immediately being removed into foster care, again, with no court order. So that's another really sinister action that's rampant throughout the CPS system.
It's pretty capricious when you talk about it's just down to an individual. I don't just like their personality or whatever's the reason. I've decided to be mean to that family. That's pretty bad. David, I see you've got your hand up. I'm going to unmute you there. Oh, there you got yourself unmuted. Go for it.
Michael, this is David Demers with the Roads to Freedom. Do you think this is symptomatic of a generally dysfunctional legal system? And if so, do you think the legal system is salvageable in the context of non-competitive governance?
Wow. I kind of need to unpack that in two different ways. Legal system here. As Kerry already alluded to, the foster family, the family courts are almost like a shadow court system, a shadow legal system. And my opinion of that is very different than the overall legal system. The overall legal system, it's easy for me to address. Let me tackle that one first. Is as an organization, I firmly believe that the latest parental rights court case out of the U.S. Supreme Court, Troxel v. Granville in 2000, it was there were 6 different decisions on the status of parental rights. None of them reached a majority, so it's not supposed to be legally binding precedent because it didn't reach a majority, but it is. And so courts all over the country are applying different standards based on this Troxel case. Up until then, anything that the court says is a fundamental right gets what's called strict judicial scrutiny. And that is that it has to be only a compelling governmental interest met by the least restrictive means and narrowly tailored to meet those needs. It passes muster, so to speak. So that's strict judicial scrutiny. And that's true for any fundamental right. But since Troxel, parentalrights.org now have the unfortunate unique position of being the one fundamental right that does not enjoy that protection. So the Supreme Court said this is a fundamental right, so you have to give a parent's decision at least some special weight. That's the court's exact words, some special weight. And so courts all over the country are deciding almost randomly. I mean, every court can decide for itself how much is some special weight, and they don't have to do strict scrutiny. Now, there are some states, like Illinois Supreme Court has come back and said, Troxel says it's a fundamental right, and in Illinois, a fundamental right gets strict scrutiny, so we're giving it strict scrutiny. And there are states that are still holding out like that, and that's good for them. But there are other states that say, well, the Supreme Court just says some special weight, and we think that was applied here, so that's good enough for New Hampshire, for instance. And so that's a problem we can definitely fix. I think the Parental Rights Amendment could fix that. Another Supreme Court case, if it were to come along, that did reach a majority decision in favor of parental rights could restore that strict judicial scrutiny. And that would go a long way to providing a single standard in the legal courts all over the country. Now, the family courts are much more difficult to fix because it is a shadow system. It is hidden. If there's no oversight, there's no accountability, then how do you fix a system like that? I think it can be done because there are good judges out there and there are good courtrooms that are providing good protection for innocent parents and good protection for abused children. It can be done, but how do we fix the entire system? That's really a big challenge, especially with the secrecy we have today.
An interesting point. To get a little bit different insight, we've got here Ralph Fusatola, who's ideally the vitamin lawyer, had a lot of stuff to deal with that side of the world. Ralph, are you still out there? I think you got yourself.
I sure am. Yes, I am.
I'd like to hear a little bit of your comment here based on the proceedings.
This is such an important issue. And one point that stuck in my mind as I was listening was that there is an alternative interpretation, for example, of shaken baby syndrome. Back in either 2013 or 2014, I forget which year, Natural Solutions Foundation hosted a 3.5-hour webinar on shaken baby syndrome, in which we had a number of world experts, including Dr. Michael Innes and then a few others who have been in the medical profession for many decades. Innes is in his 80s now. And when he was a very young doctor, he is probably one of the few doctors alive today who actually knows what non-Siemens scurvy is. That is scurvy gotten by people who are so depleted in vitamin C that they have scurvy, and he was able to compare the injuries that are seen in non-Siemens scurvy with injuries that are seen in vaccine adverse reactions. And in his considered opinion, almost every case of shaken baby syndrome is actually a vaccine reaction. And so it's important to get to those people who are concerned about the issue of parental rights and about the significant number of fathers, especially, who are in jail right now over shaken baby. That it is not, necessarily someone's violent act. It could be a reaction to a vaccine, which actually can cause bruises and similar indicia. There are certain specific problems that if a baby were actually shaken to death, there would be certain type of specific injuries to the spinal column, especially in the neck area, which do not occur in many cases of shaken baby syndrome, and which is a clear indication that these are actually adverse reactions. So that's one area of concern. The other area of concern that I have is that there are a number of vaccine pushers who are taking the position that not vaccinating your children is child abuse. And that is a really dangerous situation that is developing. And it's really important to make it clear that a conscientious objection to vaccination should never be considered child abuse. So those are the two areas where I was really concerned. And I have actually had occasion, back when I was in practice, to counsel a young couple who went through the tragedy of a child dying of sudden infant death syndrome, which again is almost always actually a vaccine reaction. So that's my take on this very important topic.
Ralph, here, real quick, Jeff. Ralph, do you have information about non-vaccination triggering CPS investigations? Ralph?
Do I have specific information? Only stuff I've read. A lot of the pro-vaxxers seem to be making sounds like that on YouTube, not on YouTube, on Facebook. So I've seen comments about that. I cannot tell you that I've actually been involved in any cases where that's happened so far. But of course, it happens in expressions of opinion probably before it happens in the real world. So it's something to be alerted to. But the shaken baby syndrome issue with fathers, especially in jail, is very real and tragic. As I said, I had at least one occasion to counsel a couple that went through that tragedy, and I was able to, because it was the daughter of an old friend of mine. I was able to counsel the father on what he had to be really careful about, because in the shaken baby syndrome cases, and one of our experts was a former police official who actually handled such cases before he understood what he was doing. So we have an understanding about the way that parents are questioned to trap them into confessing for shaken baby syndrome, when in fact the child is a victim not of the parents but rather of vaccination.
If I can interject, this is Michael. Because of our organization's name, parentalrights.org, we get a lot of phone calls from people looking for legal help in preserving their parental rights. And unfortunately, we don't have lawyers on staff and can't provide it, so we push them to a list of those organizations. But I can tell you I did get a call last week, and I can't give details. I think that's probably legally prescripted from doing that. But I did get a call last week from a family looking for a lawyer to help them because their pediatrician was going to report them for child abuse if they didn't vaccinate their children. So I can vouch for that actually happening in today.
This is Kerry. I would just also add that, Michael mentioned the sort of checklist that CPS has to go through when they open an investigation. And one of those is to get doctors' notes and records. And so I often think, if you were a family that decided not to vaccinate, or if you were going to some alternative practitioners, that potentially could change the course of your investigation and put up some red flags to the CPS officials. So there's that piece of it as well.
In fact, they can get all those records so readily. I mean, anybody else would have a major court fight or something, or subpoena or warrants or something, but here they can just get them on the stroke of a pen, it would appear.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think, and what's happening in terms of these new people coming into the country illegally, as it were, that are bringing a lot of situations where measles and things have come back, and so now they're suddenly trying to turn around and label that's from the vaccination, avoidance that some families are engaged in. They're trying to leverage that one against the other type of thing and conflate that. Where do you see this coming in terms of parental rights and everything with this huge influx of all these people that are not really citizens?
Well, of course, the 14th Amendment is clear. It applies as a due process applies to persons, while without regard to citizenship. So, it seems to me that, and the courts have been pretty clear on that over the decades. 14th Amendment tells us who is a citizen, and then it says all persons. So it applies the protections of the 14th Amendment to all persons, not just citizens.
Mm-hmm. The thing I notice, Now, parentalrights.org's official position on vaccines, we are not medical experts. We don't claim to be medical experts, and so we don't hold a position on whether they are safe or not, whether they are efficacious or not. We hold staunchly to the position that every parent should have the right to make a medically informed decision for their child. We hold to that very solidly, and so we're not pro-vax or anti-vax. We're totally solidly in the corner of parents to get to make that choice. And that means that we oppose these laws that want to mandate vaccines and remove the exemptions and that kind of thing. So having said that, I do notice, and this is more me, that I don't think I should necessarily say this with a parentalrights.org hat on, but for me personally, I do notice that measles outbreaks and all these outbreaks always tend to hit the news around December or January, right around the time that state legislatures start back. And I do find that pretty suspicious.
You always wonder about any of the timing of any of those things, in other words. And that's why I'm curious, because, that could be used as I hate to always use this term that everyone's favoring these days, it's called weaponized. But, for either side, the fact that all these things are outbreaking and, quote unquote, concurrently all these people, coming through the border, you can sort of manipulate a lot of stuff. And the sad reality of any of these government things, and again, it's so comical to us, sadly, that every week when we have this call, it always boils down to, like you said earlier, it's people. And so every problem that someone's on this call discussing, there's people involved in why it's the problem, because the solution's invariably been very commonsensical. And it's just kind of hard to get control of the legislature or have it be where everybody out on the street realizes it needs to be. It's very frustrating.
Jeff, Charlie here. Does anyone else in the audience want to ask a question?
Yes, Charles, I've had my hand up for a while.
Go for it.
This is Jamie, Kerry, and Michael. Thank you so much for your wonderful insight in your organization. I'm many things, but one of my main titles is a mom of a special needs child. And recently in West Virginia, a mom had put a recording device, and to her demise, she found out that her child was being verbally abused by her special needs teachers. What do you guys feel? To me, the first thing when I heard that, I thought, oh dear, the school districts are now going to start putting it to where parents cannot put any recording devices on their kids. And I want to see what your take on that. And if there's anything like a backlash from the school districts, if you guys heard anything about that.
I don't think there's necessarily a backlash from the school districts yet, although I think you're right that as school districts are under more scrutiny, they certainly may clamp down with whatever techniques they have at their disposal, including CPS. But I mean, I'm a staunch supporter of school choice and education freedom, and I think that drawing attention to many of the problems with particularly government schools can encourage parents to support school choice activities in their own states, legislation, and school choice options, as well as really consider alternatives.
Yeah, I agree. I think we're not going to see a whole lot of backlash in the immediate. I think the folks who would want to pass bills to help the schools protect themselves and cover themselves, they tend to be more subtle than that. It will be like a year or two down the road where folks are not able to connect it back to this case, and they'll make it sound like it's perfectly reasonable that, of course, it shouldn't be recorded without your knowledge just because you work in the public schools. I mean, you should be protected from that. If they tried to make a big outcry and push against it right now, then people would be asking, well, wait, what's precipitated this? And they'd look back, and who's not going to side with that mom? I mean, we all would. So I think it's going to be more subtle, but it is definitely something to watch for. And when it comes up, we need to remember this case and come back to it and say, now look, this is where that's coming from. This is why we should still be recording them. It's like those body cameras on police officers. This is protecting the people from the government. And this is protecting our most vulnerable. This is protecting our children with special needs. So we need to have long memories and make sure to bring that back up when the time comes.
It's a great little point. One of the persons, yes, go ahead.
There's other folks that have had experiences with CPS and family court abuse. Speak up, folks, on the call.
I had Roseanne had made a couple of good comments if she's inclined to chime in a little bit.
Hi, everybody. Sure, I'll say something. I am a naturopath in Wisconsin. I'm not licensed, but in listening to your discussion on parental rights, children's rights, I am a writer and I've done some research on this. And I don't know if this applies or not, but my mind was going to the UN agendas and the UN international treaty laws, such as the UNCRC, which is the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And I've noticed that the countries of the EU are conforming to this law. And I believe that their agenda is for all countries to conform to this law. So, we're looking at the US federal laws aligning with the UN agenda. And therefore, states don't really have autonomy, but this is where you would want autonomy. You'd want autonomy in the states to be able to either exempt from these types of laws or, like the medical cannabis laws. The states have autonomy there. They're going against the federal mandates. So these are just some of the other issues that kind of surround this parental rights issue. It's kind of bigger than what it seems to me. Does anybody have any comments on that?
So a couple of years ago, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities came before the Senate. Obama sent it over to the Senate, and it looked like it had a very good chance of being adopted. And we as an organization voiced a number of concerns based on that it would insert best interest of the child in place of parents' decisions on any court case involving a child. In the U.S., best interest of the child is what's called a dispositive decision, and that is that if it falls to the court to decide, then the court must choose what's in the child's best interest, not what's convenient to the court. But that only happens once a parent is shown to be unfit. Under the CRC or the CRPD, best interest is the standard period. So you don't have to show that a parent is unfit for a judge to say, well, yeah, mom and dad want to hold off on this vaccine, but we believe it's in the child's best interest, so we're going to order the vaccine. So that was one of the things that we were very concerned about. And we were very active in stopping that from being signed. That's our history as an organization. It's publicly, you can find that. Our president at the time, Michael Ferris, was one of the folks to testify against it in the Senate hearings, and very adamantly. So we're very much concerned about that. But strategically, we're at a standpoint right now where if we're ever going to get Democrats to work with us on our amendment, then we need to not bring up the UN thing, because that's a very divisive issue. And it's not a threat right now with a Republican president, Republican Senate. Neither of those is going to be signed or is going to be ratified by the U.S. Until there's a change of leadership. So we've been able as an organization strategically to downplay our concern with that, to not have to bring it up or address it or deal with it. Because frankly, we agree with Democrats on parental rights apart from the UN, and that's the common ground we've been trying to build. But we are aware of that UN agenda, and it is very concerning.
Okay, thank you.
Brittany, I think I see you got your hand up here too.
Yeah, so Michael addressed this a little bit, but I'm just wondering, HSLDA, the Homeschooling Legal Defense Association, provides legal support for parents who are being threatened by school districts and local governments. I'm just wondering if there's any kind of similar organization for people more generally, if someone has a threat from CPS or a threat from a medical person or a school or something. Is there a more general organization that serves that need?
Yeah, I think Diane Redleaf's organization, the work that she does with families, I'm trying to see if I can figure out the name. Maybe Michael knows off the top of his head.
Resource, I think it's Family Resource Center. No, Family Defense Center. That's it. Family Defense Center in Chicago. Now they're predominantly in Illinois. Most lawyers are licensed in one or maybe two states, and so that limits, the scope of their organization. But she's at the she founded the Family Defense Center in Chicago. She's not there now. Now she does a family consulting. I forget the name of her current business. But the Family Defense Center in Chicago is still about that work. They're predominantly in Illinois, though.
Okay. Okay. Great.
So what we point people to, if I may, is parentalrightsfoundation.org/legal. There's a list there that we've put together of some organizations. Some don't do CPS cases. Some are a different kind of parental rights, but some do CPS cases. And again, they're all regional. So some would not work in certain states, but they do in others. And so that's what we have a list there that we send people to if they come looking, for that kind of help from us.
What was the end there? Was parentalrights.org/what?
Parentalrightsfoundation.org/legal, as in legal help. We're looking for legal assistance, so it's just legal. Parentalrightsfoundation.org/legal, LEGAL.
Oh, I got to learn to spell, right?
Great. Thank you.
That was very good. All right, well, we've hit the conclusion. Like I said, I'm going to put a notice out about this event as a reminder so you can listen to it and review back on it. And then, again, announcing who's coming up. So that goes out on Mondays, mid-afternoon, so keep an eye out for that. It's going from the MailChimp system, so keep an eye. If you don't see it, check your spam. That's 4 o'clock Eastern that it's standardized to go out. Appreciate you being here today. Charles, why don't you close us out by reminding us who's going to be here next week for a quick minute.
Thanks, Jeff. And we're past an hour, but that doesn't surprise me. This is a big issue that we'll probably revisit, a few months down the road. But next week we go back to regulation. Broadly speaking, we've done some licensing privatization webinars, so this is back on that broad topic. And then Joel Salatin the next week will bring us into local family food freedom. So come back every Wednesday. And thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Kerry. Thanks, Michael. And thanks for the great questions.
Yes, indeed.
Thank you.